For years, Xi Jinping stood untouchable, a symbol of centralized power. Now, reports are emerging, backroom meetings, abrupt removals, and a sudden rise of new voices in Beijing. What's happening inside the Chinese Communist Party isn't just political. It could redefine the next decade of global influence. But most won't notice until the aftershocks reach their doorstep. This is your early warning. Pay attention. For over a decade, Xi Jinping seemed untouchable. He didn't just rule China, he embodied the state. But now, something has changed. Behind the scenes, secret meetings, sudden removals, and new figures quietly gaining ground in Beijing. While the world focuses on Taiwan or the South China Sea, the real earthquake might already be happening. Inside the Chinese Communist Party itself, Xi rose like a modern emperor. Above the rules, beyond term limits, with no visible opposition. But now, even his own allies are starting to move, as if preparing for a future without him. Just months ago, Xi disappeared from a key diplomatic summit. No explanation, no excuse. Generals once seen beside him have vanished from the media. The propaganda machine has slowed down. Even his signature slogans are fading from official speeches. At first glance, it may seem like simple fatigue. Maybe. But what if it's something much deeper? In the next few minutes, you'll understand why this silent power shift in China could reshape the world, and why no one is talking about it until it's too late. Before we go deeper, one quick thing. The headlines aren't telling you everything. This channel exists to expose what's left unsaid. The real moves behind power, collapse, and global shifts. If you want to see through the noise and stay one step ahead, subscribe now. Leave a comment if this hits you. Share it if someone else needs to hear it. Now, let's get back to Beijing. Because what's happening there won't stay there for long. To understand how a man like Xi Jinping could rise to such heights and now face such a fall, you have to go back to a time when China was fractured not by rebellion, but by silence. After the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown, the Communist Party entered a long phase of collective leadership. No one man would dominate again. That was the lesson. That was the rule. But rules mean little when history begins to forget fear. When Xi took power in 2012, he wasn't supposed to stand out. Chosen by consensus, expected to serve quietly, and fade away after 10 years. Instead, he rewrote the script. Step by step, with the patience of a dynasty builder, Xi dismantled the very system that gave him power. It started subtly, through purges dressed as anti-corruption. Tigers and flies, he called them. A metaphor for eliminating both high-ranking officials and low-level bureaucrats. But behind the slogans was a surgical strategy. Erase opposition, install loyalists, centralize authority. Over 1.5 million officials were punished. The message wasn't justice, it was obedience. Then came the imagery. Mao-style portraits, red banners, the return of ideological slogans like the China Dream, and finally, in 2018, the abolishment of term limits. A move so audacious, it shocked even the party's veterans. Xi had become not just the head of state, but the embodiment of the state itself. But power, once fully concentrated, also becomes fully exposed. With no buffer, no shared responsibility, every crisis, economic slowdown, pandemic missteps, foreign policy blunders, fell squarely on his shoulders. That's where the first hairline fractures began to form. The system had no room for dissent, but beneath the surface, it began to boil. And here's the part most people miss. Xi didn't rise alone. Behind him, a carefully cultivated network grew, the so-called Fujian clique, a circle of loyalists from his years in southeastern China, men who owed their careers to him. But what happens when those men begin to sense the tide turning? We'll return to that, because before the betrayal comes, there must be pressure. And the pressure, as you'll see next, has already begun to break through the cracks. At first glance, Beijing still moves with precision. Ceremonies remain rigid, the news tightly scripted. But behind this choreographed calm, the party is repositioning. Not publicly, not loudly, but unmistakably. It began with silence, Xi Jinping's absence from key summits. The 2024 BRICS gathering in Rio should have been a showcase for his vision of a multipolar world. Instead, he vanished, replaced by Premier Li Qiang. No explanation, no warning. Just an empty chair where a message should have been. And that wasn't an isolated event. Around the same time, a wave of purges swept through the People's Liberation Army. Generals once seen at Xi's side were abruptly retired, vanished, or reassigned. The rocket force, China's elite missile command, lost nearly all of its top brass in a matter of weeks. Officially, anti-corruption. But internally, it signaled a loss of trust at the highest level of military command. Then came Xinjiang. Ma Xingrui, a technocrat known for his loyalty, was quietly removed from his post. This wasn't routine. It marked a deeper shift, a rebalancing of regional control, driven by actors once considered Xi's inner circle. The move was subtle, but the implications were not. Someone was redrawing the map of influence inside China. And all the while, state media began to change its tone. Speeches that once glorified Xi Jinping thought began referring more broadly to party consensus. The shift is linguistic, but in China, language is power. When the collective returns to the narrative, it usually means the individual is being quietly edged out. But there's one detail the public never sees. Xi has reportedly strengthened his personal security in recent months. More bodyguards, isolated movements, tighter control over his travel schedule. A man doesn't fear assassination if he controls the narrative. Unless, of course, he no longer does. This is the point most miss. Xi's grip hasn't collapsed, but it has loosened, and those who waited silently for over a decade are beginning to test how far they can push. But who exactly are they? And why are they acting now? We'll get there. Because before a new order rises, we need to understand the anatomy of quiet rebellion. And it's already in motion. Power in China doesn't vanish. It shifts, like tectonic plates, silent until they fracture. While the world focuses on Xi Jinping, a new formation is quietly taking shape beneath him. A circle of influence not defined by public titles, but by access, timing, and survival instinct. These are not rebels in the street. They're insiders in the palace. Among them are officials Xi once elevated, men from Fujian, Zhejiang, and the Central Military Commission. Their loyalty was once absolute. But loyalty in the Communist Party has an expiration date. It lasts only as long as power remains useful. As Xi's decisions began to cost China economically and diplomatically, their silence turned to calculation. One of them is Hu Chunhua, once considered a rising star, sidelined by Xi during the 20th Party Congress. Now, quietly resurfacing through policy roles and economic recovery initiatives. Another name whispered is Chen Minner, previously Xi's enforcer in Chongqing, now repositioning himself as a voice of stability. These men aren't enemies yet, but they're no longer just allies. The recent resurgence of references to Deng Xiaoping's collective leadership isn't accidental. It's a signal, a return to balance, to control distributed among a circle, not vested in a single figure. For a system designed to avoid the volatility of personality cults, the pendulum is swinging back, slowly but visibly. And here's where the loop tightens. Reports have surfaced, leaked through overseas Chinese media and dissident channels, of contingency plans. That in the event of a national emergency, a temporary council would assume control. A reversion to a Politburo-led leadership, with Xi stepping aside for stability. Officially, these reports are dismissed. But the fact that they're circulating at all reveals something deeper: preparation. More telling, perhaps, is Xi's rumored exit strategy. A private estate in the mountains of Zhejiang, secured communications, loyalty-vetted guards. It sounds like fiction, but so did Mao's retreat plans in 1976, until they were confirmed after his death. The pattern is familiar. When power becomes absolute, the fallback becomes personal. But the critical question remains: what is this new circle planning? Not rhetorically, strategically. Are they waiting for economic collapse, a foreign policy failure, or are they simply waiting for Xi to make one final mistake? We'll revisit this, because the next moves aren't just about politics. They're about assets, borders, and weapons. And whoever controls those controls what happens next. Behind the red slogans and political rituals, China's true control mechanisms lie elsewhere, across fiber optic cables, missile silos, rare earth supply chains, and choke points at sea. Whoever controls these elements doesn't need a title. They shape outcomes without ever stepping into a spotlight. Start with the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force. Once Xi's crown jewel, now decapitated by unexplained purges. It's not just a military shift, it's a vacuum of deterrence. The rocket force oversees China's nuclear triad and long-range strike capabilities. Whoever now holds influence over this force, even partially, has leverage not just over Xi, but over the world. Then, consider the East and South China Seas. Artificial islands once celebrated as symbols of sovereignty have become liabilities, targets, not assets. Military bases there are increasingly isolated, vulnerable to satellite surveillance and naval blockade. Xi invested heavily in these outposts to project dominance. But dominance without resilience breeds overextension. And within the PLA Navy, new commanders are emerging, less loyal to ideology, more focused on survival. There's also China's digital surveillance infrastructure, Skynet, the social credit system, and internal party databases. These are more than tools of control. They are instruments of intelligence. And recent leaks suggest that portions of this data ecosystem are being quietly rerouted. A digital coup doesn't announce itself. It reroutes information silently, until one day a command is issued, and not everyone obeys. But perhaps the most overlooked domain is logistics. Ports in Sri Lanka, Djibouti, Pakistan, energy routes through the Strait of Malacca. China's global Belt and Road infrastructure was built under Xi's vision. Yet, control over these assets, especially in times of political uncertainty, rests in the hands of financiers, regional operatives, and foreign partners. If the internal party consensus shifts, so can the international alignment. Now ask yourself this: if a rival bloc inside the party wanted to remove Xi without civil conflict, how would they do it? They wouldn't storm Zhongnanhai. They'd take control of these levers: missile command, digital networks, energy routes, and let the system isolate him naturally. A silent cordon, dressed in protocol. But there's one more element that changes everything: a strategic ambiguity no one in the West seems to fully grasp, and it's about to enter the spotlight. Let's talk about what happens next, because the future scenarios aren't just possible. They're already forming. Nothing in China happens suddenly. Collapse is not an explosion, it's a reconfiguration. That's why, as Xi's grip weakens, the more interesting question isn't if he falls, but how the system evolves, and who shapes it from the inside out. One scenario, increasingly plausible, is controlled transition. Not an official abdication, but a silent sidelining. Xi remains the face of stability, outwardly intact, but real authority shifts to a restored collective. A handful of Politburo members begin issuing directives. Policies become less ideological, more pragmatic. The tone softens, foreign relations stabilize. But behind that calm lies a deal. Xi is contained, not removed. And in return, the party avoids fracture. Yet there's a darker possibility: internal rupture. A faction, emboldened by economic failures or a geopolitical blunder, takes decisive steps. Xi resists. Information warfare escalates. Military units split in loyalty. Beijing enters a moment of paralysis, with multiple centers of command and no single narrative. This doesn't mean tanks in the streets. It means silence in the corridors, delayed orders, meetings that never happen. The system doesn't explode, it freezes. Then comes the external variable. If the West senses Xi's decline, it could act, subtly or overtly. Sanctions could tighten. Covert signals might be sent to alternative leaders. Taiwan could become the match to a chamber filled with gas. Not because the West wants regime change, but because uncertainty invites boldness. The more fragmented Beijing appears, the more foreign actors will test its limits. And that could spiral into conflict neither side fully controls. But here's the wild card. What if none of these factions truly want to lead? What if the game isn't about replacing Xi, but surviving his decline? In that case, we enter a phase of hollow rule. Xi remains. No one obeys fully. Everyone hedges. The system drifts into oligarchy. Many hands on the wheel, none willing to take responsibility. And that's where things get dangerous. Because in a vacuum of direction, mistakes multiply. Wars start not from decisions, but from miscalculations, from assumptions made in silence. So now, ask yourself, which of these futures is already unfolding? Which has the most signs visible right now? And what happens if the party no longer believes in the man who once promised to be the party itself? We're not done. The final piece isn't about strategy or politics. It's about the illusion of permanence. And what happens to nations when that illusion dies? Stay with me. If you've made it this far, it means you don't just want to know what's happening. You want to understand why it matters and what it means for all of us. That's rare, and it's powerful. The truth is, we're watching history unfold in real time, not just in China, but across the globe, where power shifts, alliances break, and old empires bend under new pressures. But despite the darkness, there is always a pattern, always a logic behind the chaos. And that's where this channel comes in. Here, we break through the noise. We dive deep into global conflicts, untangle hidden power games, explore forgotten history, and trace the paths of leaders, those rising and those quietly falling. We connect the dots that others leave scattered, and we do it not to alarm, but to prepare. Because when you understand the system, you're no longer just reacting, you're navigating. If this resonated with you, subscribe. Not just to follow, but to join a growing network of people who think deeper, ask harder questions, and refuse to be passive. Leave a like if this helped you see something new. Share this video if you think someone else needs to understand what's really shifting behind the headlines. And if you have a question, drop it in the comments. I'll be there responding, thinking with you. We don't know exactly how this will end, but we do know one thing. Power never disappears. It transforms. And those who pay attention today will shape the story tomorrow. The next chapter is coming. Stay with us.